Good, good morning, good morning, good morning. It is March 8th, 2026, and this is a special edition of Anchor Watch. I'm your host, Bobby Jones, and I just wanted to come online this morning on a Sunday and basically give you an overview of the first week, a little well over a week now, of combat operations that the United States and Israel have started with Iran. And there are a lot of different aspects, perspectives that are being floated around. And what is bothering me is I don't see a lot of the fluff being taken out. I see a lot of posturing and peacocking, but and people speaking in terms that, quite honestly, um, are meant to sound flashy, so you don't ask the real questions. And so what I'd like to do today is just basically ask you guys what you guys are seeing and what your questions are as we get into this, because I think it's important that people understand this is not going to be something that is a short term or easy operation to get off from under. It's going to be much more involved. And if we're not careful, it's going to make Afghanistan and Iraq, at least for the United States forces, look like a church picnic. So, one of the things that I want to do here is just basically go through and explain what's not being talked about. So, let's start there. And then I'm going to talk about this triangle of perspective that I think people need to understand. And then finally, I want to talk about um, how the actual service members are having to deal with this and how they're being treated by the leadership. And then I also want to make sure that you guys can ask the questions that you want to ask, and hopefully I can answer it. And if I can't answer them, then I'll do the research and find the answer. So first of all, every press briefing that you've seen from either Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth or Marco Rubio, two things jump out. Number one, depending on which one of the three you're talking to, you get a different justification for why these actions are taking place, which is a telltale sign that strategically people are not aligned across the board. Trump is in his own world, it seems like. Hegseth feels compelled to be a peacock, just talking about how awesome military might is because he's responsible for it. And Rubio is making it sound like he's open to regime change anywhere in the world, Cuba, etc. But throughout all of the sizzle, the steak is very thin. They are talking about the numbers of what's been shot down, what's been hit. What they're not talking about is the type of targeting that's happening here. So, what I mean by that is very simply, Iran has an obvious strategy, and that is to attack logistical hubs of the United States military infrastructure in the region. Why? Because there's a saying that goes back to World War II, that amateurs think tactics, professionals think logistics. Why? Because when you're dealing with any type of military campaign that's going to last any amount of time, you have to think about the supply line that limits or advances your forces. And so let's give a big overview. There are about 40 to 50,000 American service members in CENTCOM, United States Central Command, the Middle East, the military's area of responsibility when it comes to the Middle East, spread out over approximately 19, 20 different bases, etc. The Iranians have hit 27 plus targets now, that have American service members, Americans, and allies all over the region. And it is obvious that they are hitting and targeting logistical hubs, not the actual forces, but the logistics. What do I mean by that? They've hit Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Okay, when you hear them talking about Doha, they're specifically talking about Al Udeid. And again, just so you know, my background, I was part of military defense agency. I helped design the air defense architecture that is now being put to use at an unbelievable rate. So I would have to go specifically to that base multiple times a year to run tests to make sure things work. So I'm intimately familiar with the infrastructure there. it has been hit a few times. Okay. It's been targeted many times. You have um, Bahrain, home of the United States Fifth Fleet. Okay. Not only is it the headquarters of the actual staff of the fleet, but it's a major logistical hub for Navy ships. You also have um, ports in UAE, specifically Jebel Ali, and Fujairah, which when I was a commanding officer, my unit, the one that's behind me, was responsible for those bases. I was in charge of those bases personally. So I know what's there. And again, these are places that US Navy ships pull into, just like Al Udeid is the hub and the largest base we have in the Middle East, but the hub of all the air operations in the Middle East. Then you have different places like in Kuwait. That's where our major air surveillance infrastructure is. Saudi Arabia, you have communications and radars there. They are specifically targeting not necessarily the forces, but things that support the forces. And in all of the explanations that you're hearing from Trump and Hegseth and the peacocking and pumping their chest, what you're not hearing is the actual damage to American infrastructure that helps sustain operations. Why does this matter? Because at the same time that this is happening, President Trump is saying we don't need the United Kingdom, we don't need this country, we don't need that country. Well, you're going to need somebody because right now, the United States Navy ships cannot really pull into any of the ports in the Middle East. They can't. And why does that matter? Because they have to be resupplied, with food, fuel, and most importantly now, the missiles that are being expended by the United States Navy in particular, the Tomahawks, the SM missiles that are air defense. There's a certain amount of limited cells they have on those ships that fire those missiles. And once they're firing, they don't magically, like a video game, replenish themselves. And this is something I'm going to talk about later, this whole video game mentality, but they don't replenish themselves. They have to pull in somewhere, drop anchor somewhere, whatever, and get more missiles. So if you can't pull into the ports that I just mentioned because they've been hit and are consistently being targeted, how are you going to resupply these forces? How? Okay. If you have air bases that are under attack and your logistics of air comes and they cannot land because the runways are jacked or they're consistently under attack, how are you going to move the troops that you want to move consistently? Right. And this is the part that people don't understand that are looking and just listening to the press briefings. And the press needs to be asking these questions. You're sitting there saying you don't need support from certain countries, right? And at the same time, you're talking about we can be independent, but like I said, you can't tell me how you're going to resupply. And of course, they wouldn't say it publicly, but the fact of the matter is, no one's even asked the question. So, how long can we hold out the current level of activity? That's a very good question. That brings me to my next major point: missiles versus interceptors. So, there's two things that I think about when trying to keep these forces, American forces, on station and fighting. Number one, we just talked about the supply lines, the logistics, etc. The other that people keep talking about, but has a legitimate point, is the inventory of ammunition, munitions that we have. In this case, how many interceptors does the United States, Israel have versus the amount of missiles that are being shot? So it's believed, and according to, and I'm going to use unclassed numbers here based on public knowledge. It's believed that there are over 2,500, maybe up to 3,000 ballistic missiles that Iran has in its inventory. Okay. In the first week that we've seen, over 500 have been shot, but that's not even counting the over 1,000, almost 2,000 drones that are believed to be in their inventory, so much so that they've given some to Russia to use in the Ukraine war, right? Now, they're able to produce these things about 100 or a little over 100 a month, according to public records. This is significant because the amount of interceptors the United States supposedly had in the theater at the beginning of this year was under 1,000. Under 1,000. And why does this matter? Well, this matters because obviously just from the get-go, you don't have enough. But then there's this thing that's called doctrine. And the doctrine of using these interceptors is you basically shoot three, two to three, maybe four, depending on the type of threat it is, for every one missile. And the reason for that is it increases what we call the PK, or the probability of kill. For those who don't understand, you keep hearing ballistic missiles. It's very simple. If I take a baseball and I throw it in the air and you catch it, it takes this natural arc, right? This natural arc is a ballistic arc. So it's not as technical as people think it is, but it's just what a ball would actually do: go up, come down. Now, as that ball is being thrown in the air, imagine taking another baseball and trying to throw at it and hit it in the air. That's what these interceptors are supposed to do. It's hard with just baseballs. Now imagine doing that thousands of feet in the atmosphere at things going, as fast as the speed of sound or faster. That's the problem. So in order to knock these things down, you don't just send one interceptor, you send two or three in case they miss. And depending on how important the protected asset is that you're trying to protect, the more missiles you'll throw at it. This is why you hear UAE, Qatar, and other allies in the region desperately reaching out to the United States to provide more interceptors because they're running out. They're running out. And when I worked at Missile Defense Agency, one of the things I had to do was travel the world and talk to different countries about the priority of their protection. What area, what assets do you value as number one that have to be protected, and then walk your way down? Everything can't be number one as much as you want to knock down everything, because you're limited in the amount of weapons that or the amount of interceptors that you have. So you have to prioritize. We're seeing that happening real time. And so while Pete Hegseth is bragging about, well, the amount of ballistic missiles have dropped, attacks have dropped 86%, he fails to mention that the scope and the range of where these things are now hitting have become more spread out, which means interceptors have to travel further, and you have to probably fire more to get a higher probability of kill to protect what you believe is valuable. I hope that makes sense. That's what's happening. That's why it's no coincidence you had all the major defense contractors meet with the president in the Oval Office. And to watch the press secretary for the White House sit there and say this was a previously scheduled meeting weeks in advance, she may be right, but I highly doubt it, because the United States understands that we're running out of interceptors, so much so that they're trying to move another radar system and interceptor system from South Korea into the Middle East theater. So again, don't look at what these people are saying. Look at what's actually happening. The movement of forces is the telltale sign. So when the 82nd Airborne has canceled a previously scheduled exercise, and their quick reaction force is put on notice, this means they are serious about putting troops on the ground, just like moving a missile battery from South Korea to the Middle East. So, to answer the question, how long can they hold out? Well, many experts, and I'll use them as the example, many experts are saying you're talking about maybe a week more tops of interceptors that'll be able to be used. However, we don't know how many drones in actuality and how many ballistic missiles in actuality does Iran have. I personally believe they're waiting out everything else. So their salvo size, the amount of weapons and that they're shooting in the theater, have gone down because they're conserving their inventory until all the interceptors are expended. So while we're peacocking and talking about how we're knocking down these weapons, no one's talking about the logistics supply chain, and they're not talking about what happens when they do get critical and what's next, right? That's the issue that we're dealing with here. So let's cut through all the BS. Let's talk about those numbers. Now, some other things to think about too. The Strait of Hormuz has been in the news because it is a choke point for the world, not just military action. When I mean when I mean choke point, you've heard that, hey, 20% of the world's oil supply goes through there. These are facts. 30% of natural gas goes through there. These are facts. But also, Most of the things, a lot of the things that you even have on your body that you wear is petroleum based. There's a ripple effect into the manufacturing base of the world too by this happening. And you have seen, if you've not paid attention, there have been multiple economists who said, hey, this whole thing where the Strait of Hormuz is under dubious operational capacity can only last about a month until the entire world starts to crumble economically. Okay, so we're 1 week into a 4 week process of economic degradation. We've already seen the gas prices go up in the United States. Already seen it. Okay. Now, understand there's about a week to 2 week lag and major impact of economics when it comes to gas and this, that, and the other when the Middle East goes through these things. You know, the OPEC nations, all these things, all these people are sitting there looking at this, wondering when stability will reestablish itself. Well, doesn't seem like it's happening anytime soon based on the news that, hey, Dubai International Airport, a place I've flown into so many times I've lost count, hit in the last 24 hours. You have, you know, the Iranian president apologizing to his to his Gulf nation neighbors, but at the same time, a new supreme leader has allegedly been elected, and they're like, no, we're not apologizing to anybody. So even internally in Iran, you don't know what they're doing. And at the same time that the allies of the United States, where we have these bases, are trying to operate, they're looking at the United States like you're not protecting us, and at the same time trying to talk to Iran about how do we ramp this thing down. There is no strategic symmetry throughout any of this. And so the instability will continue to spook the markets and we will feel it. If I was running Iran's military, what would be my strategy? Very simple. I would wait these guys out. I would throw, my cheaper, more or less complicated weapons at the United States and its allies, forcing their air defense systems to continue to intercept these things. And once their sugar count, once their inventory is low and we know it and you can tell because they have augmented their doctrine of how many they're going to shoot at what, then I bring out the big dogs. I bring out the drones, I bring out all this, and then I just hammer the logistical places. And here's the thing, they're doing that, but the other piece that they're doing too, they're hitting civilian soft targets of economic interest. They're attacking a desalinization plant, for example. I think that was in Saudi Arabia. They're hitting places, oil refineries. They're trying to bring these allies who house American troops to their knees economically to put pressure on the United States. And that's what I would do. I would just do it in a more grandiose fashion. Here's the other thing. The desalinization plant attack is huge, huge, because that is how the Middle East gets its fresh water, desalinization. And so if you continue to hit those, you're bringing in a region to its knees because it's not even a quality of life issue. It's a survivability issue. Right. And so these are the things that they're doing that none of it's being talked about in the press briefings. None of it is being talked about holistically. Um, well, where can a civilian see facts and metrics about ships and other movements? Well, I would say your news sources matter. So, like, I personally would say BBC, Sky News, and First Post on YouTube. But like, there's this thing called the UK MTO, so the UK Maritime Traffic Operations Center, who tracks tankers and vessels that move, right. And you can see in the Arabian Gulf right now the backlog and the lack of movement, ships anchoring and trying to stay out of it. Yeah, you can definitely check that out. Um, there are other places that are pretty good feeds of information. On X or Twitter, they have OSINT Defender, so basically open source intelligence defender. They do a very good job of tracking air, ground, surface movements. And they're pretty good about, and the thing I like about them is they post videos and social media reports that come from the actual people on ground that, to be honest, Iran and Israel are censoring, and they're getting video that's showing this. So like when those American pilots were shot down because of friendly fire in Kuwait. They were the ones that broke that video and stuff like that because everybody's going to sit there. Oh, that didn't happen. Yeah, it happened. It happened, and that's part of the issue that we're all dealing with. And one of the reasons why I wanted to come on is because right now the propaganda aspect of all of this is unreal. We expect it from Iran, but I don't think compared to previous wars that people in America realize just how much the message is being restricted and trying to be shaped. For example, you can't just have all these interceptors go away and we're not producing many on a regular basis, right? To keep up with the production. Um, those are the type things that they don't want to talk about. And then when you bring up the American loss of life, the absolute ridiculousness of that, and I'll get into that a little bit later, blows my mind. Um, is troop going to address, of course? So, you know, they one media member tried to ask that question when Trump was sitting down discussing, college sports and how vital and important that is. If you ask me, I don't think he's ever going to address it because and then he has to acknowledge the fact that Vladimir Putin is directly not only tipping the scales of what this conflict is, but he would have to check Putin. He's not going to do that. Despite the fact that he's the commander in chief, despite the fact that every American that is injured, that is in harm's way, that dies is on him, he won't do it. We're talking about a man that literally rolled out the red carpet for this guy. So I don't see that changing. I do think you're going to see Russia and China more proactively involve themselves in this for various reasons because Iran is the major outside oil supplier for both Russia and China. Okay. Their stability, their mindset, the way they go about making sure that their supplies continue to flow is of huge national security to them. To them. And so they're very interested in the regime change. They're very interested to see how this plays out because it directly ties to them. Um, the United States, with our current foreign policy, when dealing with Russia in particular, and China to a secondary degree, we have not been proactive in doing anything about this, about Russia and its interference, both internally to the United States and beyond. So these are things that you have to really, really consider when you're wondering why Trump's not calling out Putin. He didn't call him out for the Ukraine war and this, that, and the other. Okay, fine. Now you're dealing with American forces. You have bases hit the most amount of attack on U.S. military bases since Vietnam. Okay, if you want to put this in historical perspective, getting schwacked repeatedly, just whap, whap, whap. I mean, Kuwait, Jordan. I mean, we can just go down the list, right? And they're not going to address it. They're not going to address the Strait of Hormuz being under threat. They're not going to address the fact that, hey, in the last 24 hours, the U.S. Embassy in Oslo, Norway, has been attacked. Why? Because just like I said, when this thing broke out, part of the retaliation we're going to see is the activation of terrorist cells. Okay. This is how Iran is going to do it. They are the largest sponsor of terrorism, state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They have networks, right? So when people in America are like, oh, we don't have to worry about anything, you need to worry about terrorist cells being activated. And you need to worry about, the ideology and not the appearance of who could be that person. Don't look just for some Middle Eastern person. That's, first of all, that's ridiculously racist. But here's the thing, you have all sorts of type of people in these networks. So you don't know. So the fact that Oslo's been hit, of all places, there's apparently an attempted terrorist attack at Gracie Mansion, the home of the New York City mayor here, that they're trying to figure out if that's related or associated to any of this stuff. They don't know. But the fact that the uncertainty is there shows you the potential chaos that could happen that has nothing to do with the military action necessarily in the Middle East, but the retaliation outside of military action that Iran is capable of. And no one's really talking about this. This is why, the propaganda that you're seeing is dangerous because it's very scoped, it's very narrow, and it does not warn the American people of what could happen. Most importantly, it's not informing the American people of what is happening. So that being said, The reality on the ground, we're not going to get a good view of because of the censorship. And until we start seeing, steady social media reports, steady reports from people who are there who have gotten out, we're not going to get a full view of this. Um, the way I see it, the military action that's happening in the Middle East has an international fallout and a domestic fallout for the United States. You know, Internationally, you got all six Gulf Cooperation Council countries. That's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, all under attack by Iran. That's significant. That's significant. Let's see. Iran is reporting that the U.S. struck a deescalation plan. That would be a critical escalation. I 100% agree with you. I 100% agree with you because when you talk about desalinization in the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, you're talking about cutting off water. And that changes the entire dynamic of this. Now you're crossing a threshold where there's not only escalation. Now you got to start sitting there and start worrying about potential crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, this, that, and the other, depending on how things are targeted. Because when you target civilian infrastructure like that, this is where rules of engagement kick in, which Pete Hegseth famously said in his last briefing that they're not worried about rules of engagement. There's a reason that rules of engagement exist. They exist because we have seen the horrors of war and we've seen how people who have not a damn thing to do about it have suffered. And so as we continue to go down this rabbit hole of depravity, make sure you understand that the Secretary of Defense has blatantly said there are no rules of engagement. So keep that in mind, especially if we put boots on the ground in Iran. Just keep that in mind. And remember, you heard it here first. There is a reason why we have these things. There is a reason why these things were created over the course of hundreds of years of modernized, mechanized warfare. According to recent polls, 6 out of 10 Americans oppose all of this, flat out. And that crosses into MAGA, or previously thought of as MAGA territory. The question of constitutionality domestically has come up. Senator Tim Kaine being one of these people who are saying that, because here's the thing, even with the War Powers Act, you're talking about 90 days. This is going to last longer than 90 days, whether it's a kinetic hot war, as you may think, or does it become an insurgent based war? But the way things are rolling, by the time we get to 90 days, we more than likely have boots on the ground in Iran, going into that stupid forever war that Trump talked all this smack about going back to 2011. Okay. You just don't do it. Rule of law is not really, well, yeah, right. And here's the thing about that. If you think rule of law doesn't apply to you, then the people that you're going against also will adopt that policy. Right. And so you can sit there and say, they better not do this, they better not do that. Okay, well, yeah, you can say that all you want to, but they're going to do it. Once you cross a line, they're going to cross a line too. And you think just because you have better weapons, that necessarily means victory. When in fact, it's not just weapons, it's also the resilience to the weapons and the will and determination to win, or in some cases, just not lose. And that's where it becomes dangerous. I don't think the American public wants that. I don't think the international public wants that. But here we are. Trump has escalated the rhetoric, talking about, hey, they will use ground troops if needed. That's what he said. And to be completely honest, regime change historically has never happened. There are multiple scholars, Google them, that have talked about this. Regime change has never happened solely based on an air campaign. Can't do it. People wait you out. They can wait you out. They can literally hunker down in their bunkers and wait you out. So at some point, ground forces are going to have to go into Iran. Now, what's interesting is the United States initially was trying to get the Kurds to do that, but the Kurds, with their complicated history in the region and with the United States, the United States abandoning them at various points in Iraq and Afghanistan, that whole thing. All of a sudden, Trump has backed off of that in the last 24 hours. I guess the intel community got to him and said, you do not want the Kurds to be the force on the ground, which goes further into my statement that the likelihood of American troops being on the ground based on movement, not talk, movement, has become much more real in the last 72 hours. Much much more real. Um, do we know which U.S. submarines sank this year? We have a very good idea of which ship sunk, which boat. When we say boat, that's what we call submarines. Which boat sunk the ship? I am not going to say who it is or what they did, but yeah, there are open source reporting that talks about which submarine they believe it was, and the circumstances to which it was. This is the type of thing that I mean by propaganda hit. They want that smoke. They want people to fear and think that this is the coolest thing since sliced bread. Do I agree with it? No, but here we are. So, um, and this leads me to this major final point that I'm just trying to wrap my head around, and that is how the administration is treating and referring to the troops that they're putting in harm's way. You know, um, Trump has basically said at the talk of American service members losing their lives, it's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. It's what comes with it, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the media asks Hegseth about it, he says that, they're just trying, the media is just trying to make Trump look bad. I have never in my entire life, and this is not an exaggeration, seen such callous conversation regarding the lives of servicemen. I believe that Trump thinks that these guys are solely here to do his bidding. That's what I honestly believe. And when you take war footage and mix it with Call of Duty video game references and movie references, and it comes from the White House, you can tell that they don't take this serious. You can tell. And then the final insult to injury to me was the dignified transfer of the six that have already been killed, getting to Dover, and the president of the United States has a baseball cap on. This is the picture that's going to be sent to the families of those fallen. The same people is like, it's just the way it, he said it's just the way it is. Who knows if he wrote a condolence letter or contacted the families? Probably not. But the fact that he had on a baseball cap and was sitting there, so these are the same people who got on Obama for in a tan suit. All of a sudden, a baseball cap at freaking Dover, where you're receiving the fallen, is considered acceptable. And if nothing else, all of this has just made me believe that the MAGA thing is an actual cult because they're literally eating their own promises. Let's see. What's your take on the reporting of the complaints around this more being trigger? So, yeah, anytime, let's see, is there a way for the chaplain court to counsel? So, these are very good questions. Anytime that there has been conflict, at least in my military career, that took place in the Middle East and Israel was involved, you would hear a small number of people saying this. The religious right, that, to be honest, a lot of those people um, are the ones that do join the military. They come from southern states as opposed to northern states, etc. So there's always been this little undercurrent. What's happened here is when you have a Secretary of Defense that has a Crusader tattoo on his chest, you know, which goes to white supremacy ties and stuff like that. Of course, this is going to happen. And so, yeah, the complaints are being made. Hegseth won't do a damn thing about it. Won't do a damn thing about it. And I'm still waiting on him to comment on it. But make no mistake, there are those who have always been in the military who believes war in the Middle East is the Armageddon trigger. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's not going to really be effective with the force because they're like, come on, man. We're a cynical bunch, to be honest. But if Congress had anything called a spine, they would immediately launch an investigation on that. The House and Senate Armed Service Oversight Committees should dig into that now. Now, because now it's not even about what's happening immediately, but what type of precedence does this set moving forward? Well after Trump is out of office and dead, do you want a military that's aligning itself with certain religions? Because if you do, that's what you're going to get when you look at Iran. That's what they have. That's what you have with certain forces, and you see how that works. So they need to launch an investigation immediately, if for no other reason to put pressure on Hegseth and his administration at the Pentagon to sit there and put out a statement or make a video because, hey, you have a problem with the whole unlawful orders video. You need to counter and say, hey, this is not a religious war, blah, blah, blah. But Hegseth honestly believes it, or at least that's what he likes to portray himself as. Let's see, the two times. I would agree. Actually, I would agree. And I would say that any type of military action that's attached to any type of religious ideology is dangerous, in my humble opinion. Historically speaking, that has been the case. As far as the people, as far as the people who fall into these two camps, I think you're right. And that's why the founding fathers, all the way back then, made it a point to make the government structure as um, non religious as possible. Non religious as possible. And when they started, they were supposed to be they were supposed to be apolitical as far as parties go. But, they as soon as Washington died, they quickly went away from that. But we're dealing with the fallout of unchecked religious influence now in the military. But hey, it started out politically, right? And so now we're falling into a trap. And what I mean by that is that has hit the media. If you don't think the Iranians have heard that, you're crazy because they're looking at this, they've already framed it as another crusade, another Western crusade into the Middle East. That's the type of thing that crystallizes and radicalizes people who may have been moderate before, but now they go outside and they see that their neighborhood has been bombed from death from above. And then you hear these reports of the Americans are looking at this as a Christian religious war. That's how you create extremists who weren't extremists to begin with. That's the power of words and the ideologies that are pushed from leadership. And without them checking it, it's going to continue. And these are longer strategic based thought processes that are happening. Um, yes, I would agree with that statement in many, many ways. It's just, different shades, literally and figuratively. Um, so as you guys watch the news, there are a couple of things I would like for y'all to watch and listen for. Forget the aw shucks, all amazing. Hey, this military force did this and this was blown up and we're dominated, blah, blah, blah. Start listening for if they talk about bases being hit and where those bases are. Start listening for personnel and weapons movement. Are people being put into the area of responsibility, the AOR, and are weapons being moved? Now, even if they do talk about it to be very top level, but the acknowledgement of shifts. And then also listen for what the latest reason for doing this is. So those are three major things that you need to listen for. Because if you hear it from Hegseth, right? And then maybe 3 hours later, you hear it from Trump, do these things align? And then when you hear it from Rubio, do they align? And mind you, people, while we're talking about this and we're focused on this, you have active conflict with United States forces in Ecuador. And if y'all heard or seen anything about that, have you heard the media talking about it? Right? You have Rubio talking about Cuba, which is, his bread and butter. It's one of the things that has driven him for so many years because of his background, right? You're seeing this expansionism based solely on military action that looks a lot like the colonial era and then the era right before World War One that kicked off these wars. The same mistakes are being repeated. And because you have people in that White House that don't understand or know history, where you have people who act in shadow president type like mentality, Stephen Miller, we are being dragged down a path that we're not even aware of how dangerous it is. This is not hyperbole. History teaches us these things. And so as I sit there and I watch this and I'm up at night, you can ask why if I'm staring at the ceiling or looking online and this, that, and the other. I believe that our ignorance to what is happening and the ignorance to our history is going to affect negatively what's happening in the future. Because as this man says, we don't want these, he said we didn't want these forever wars. If you got a kid that's in middle school or high school, right? I don't see an off ramp where your kid may not be fighting these wars in the next couple of years because there is no off ramp. I cannot tell you what an off ramp looks like right now. If the United States right now just stopped and said, okay, we've proven the point, we've gotten a new Ayatollah, and we've degraded Iran militarily, do you really think the Iranians are going to sit there and say, okay, cool, we'll just go back and rebuild? Do you really think that? So we've painted ourselves into a diplomatic corner with the paintbrush of military action. It's that simple. But they want you to admire the strokes of the paintbrush so you don't recognize the fact that you can't move anywhere. And that's dangerous. All right, so let's see. Are there any more questions that we have, Sam? Anybody? Um, I want to make sure that there are no questions left unanswered before I go offline here. No, no problem. It's just this is just very unique. Do you think any of our allies will enter into war? Not if they can help it. Not if they can help it. Because here's the thing. I wrote about this on my Substack this week. There was a show back in the early 2000s called Pros versus Joes, where they took retired professional athletes and they went against these, workout warriors, athletic civilian types, right? Who, were cocky and believed that they were in their athletic prime and they could beat these former professionals. Well, if you go on YouTube and see these clips of Pros versus Joes, it was hilarious because these retired athletes, past their prime, just on muscle memory, would beat the absolute hell out of these so-called super athletic civilians because the level to reach a professional athletics, the level to get there is so high that most people don't understand that, right? We are living in a pro versus Joe administration with Trump. You have professionals that were careerists at doing diplomacy, military, that were all forced out. You know, if you were a minority and had 3 stars or above, or a woman 3 stars and above in the military, they kicked you out of operational command when they first came in again. If you were a career State Department person that was a subject matter expert on various areas of the world, they sent you out. They kicked you out. You kicked out the professionals and you got a bunch of Joes who were just loyal to Trump. Loyal to Trump. And this is why you have this fiasco. You have a bunch of dudes, mostly dudes, overwhelmingly dudes, that thought that they could do the same thing that these professionals have spent an entire lifetime creating, right? That's what it is. Okay. And so because you have this, right, and everything's falling apart, the rest of the world, going to the original question you asked, have professional diplomats, professional strategists still in their seats. And there's no way in hell they're going to sign up for this. Because number one, they understand strategically the long game and how jacked up it is. Number two, they don't want to deal with the Joes, the non-professionals, because you can't trust them. I mean, think about it. Just the rationale for doing this has changed multiple times in the week, 9 days that this has been going on, because they don't know. If you are an ambassador to the United States from, I don't know, France or Italy, and you're seeing this, how can you trust the word that's coming out of the State Department's mouth? You can't. So if you can't even trust them after 80 years of being allies, what's coming out of their mouth, how could you commit military forces? You can't. You can't. And so that's where we are. Do you not think? Um, Eventually, yes. If this thing drags out, and this is the thing. Trump has been able to start these conflicts and shut them off with a switch, like a light switch. Shut it on, shut it off. Shut it on, shut it off, without having to deal with the fallout. He can't do that with this. And I'm going to be very clear. The second the Ayatollah was killed, all bets were off with a claim to that. Yeah, you were able to do it with Operation Midnight Hammer, but you didn't try to decapitate the Iranian leadership. Now you have. And because of that, that's a blood debt. That's a blood debt. And so the couple of weeks, you know, how they're slowly, you know, market testing. Oh, this is going to be more than a couple of weeks, maybe a few months, maybe into September, but they're slowly walking that timeline longer, if you've not noticed, because the reality of the action is happening. And that is where the morale is going to go down. You have extended deployments across the region. Cats that are supposed to already be coming back home with their families. Nope, not happening. They're staying there. Okay. That has an effect. And then when you don't even know why the hell you're doing it, that has an effect. So the morale will slowly come down because you have not provided why you're doing it. You have not provided what success looks like, what the end state is. And most importantly, this is what's interesting. You are not, as this thing unfolds, giving the daily updates, the pep talks, this, that, and the other. You're leaving it up to the unit commanders. And depending on where your unit is, heck, you're being told this is Armageddon. This is a shit sandwich. And no one can tell you what the end will look like or when it could actually happen. That simple. It's that simple. Um, any other issues, any other questions that you guys may have? Um, I just wanted to come online this morning and just kind of clarify some things. Like we need to cut through a lot of the propaganda. And Sunday mornings is usually when everybody goes on their talk shows with their prepared talking points and try to give that to you. But the reality is that is not the case. There's a reality here that physics, math, and geography are pushing that no one's trying to talk about. That's the reality. That's the reality. Um, I will be going live with our weekly live stream Anchor Watch. That's on Tuesdays. We try to get subject matter experts to talk about things, but most importantly, the attempt is to break down things where you understand it. And today we talked about motive, why, the lack thereof. We talked about what even ballistic missile defense kind of is, et cetera, the math of the region, but most importantly, trying to give you a better idea of what to look for. And hopefully this helps. Um, and call your Congress people, because right now I think this is a completely, basically an illegal action. There's been no declaration. There's been no nothing. So now that you're more informed, talk to your congressional representatives and say, hey, what are you going to do about this? How long is this acceptable? I don't care if you're in a red state, blue state, whatever state. You need to have them do their job and hold people accountable. Well, that's all I have for this Sunday morning. Hopefully better news will happen. Although, quite honestly, I don't know how. I don't. I don't know where the off ramp is, but please pay attention to your surroundings because everything is changing. And most importantly, get involved with your government and help them hold the current administration accountable. Thanks, everyone.